Everything you were taught about the Philippines before the Spanish arrived, most of it was a lie, and I can prove it. I'm Mr. AK, and if you're around my age, you probably sat in a classroom in the 1960s or 70s and learned that our ancestors were primitive people living in jungle huts, waiting to be civilized. I learned the same thing. My own teachers taught me that. But here's what they didn't know. Historians have spent the last 50 years digging up evidence, actual physical proof, that completely contradicts what was in those old textbooks. And today, I'm going to show you 5 of the biggest lies we were all taught. Now, I'm not blaming our teachers. They taught what they were taught. But it's time we learned the truth. Our goal on this video is to get 500 likes and subscribe Time Forge Stories. Click on bell and turn on notifications. So let's get started. Lie number 1. The Philippines had no civilization before Spain. Picture this. It's the year 900 AD. Europe is in the Dark Ages. Vikings are raiding coastlines. And in a place called Laguna, in the Philippines, someone is writing out a legal contract on a copper plate. That copper plate still exists. A worker found it in 1989 while dredging a creek. When scientists examined it, they nearly fell over. It's dated to the year 900, written in Old Malay, and it's a receipt for a debt being cleared. Think about what that means. Our ancestors weren't just living in villages. They were writing contracts. They had lawyers, or at least scribes. They had a calendar system. They were keeping financial records. But wait, there's more. Chinese traders from the Song dynasty, around the year 1000, wrote about doing business with a place they called Ma'ai, which is Mindoro. They described organized ports, government officials regulating trade, and standardized weights and measures. Does that sound primitive to you? When the Spanish actually arrived in 1521, their own journals tell a different story than what ended up in our textbooks. Antonio Pigafetta sailed with Magellan, and he wrote about meeting Raja Humabon in Cebu. He described elaborate ceremonies, diplomatic protocols, and being served food on Chinese porcelain. Chinese porcelain, that means they were trading with China. They had international business relationships. The Spanish described a whole social structure. Datas who ruled, Mahalikas who were noble warriors, Timawas who were free commoners. This wasn't a primitive tribe. This was an organized society with social classes, laws, and government. So why were we taught otherwise? Because if Spain admitted they were conquering sophisticated kingdoms, it would be harder to justify. They needed the world to believe they were bringing civilization to savages. It was propaganda, and somehow that propaganda ended up in our school books 50 years later. Lie number 2. Filipinos wore no clothes until Spain taught them modesty. I remember my teacher saying this, and even as a kid I thought it sounded strange. We're talking about people living in a tropical country. Did they really run around naked? No, of course not. The Spanish themselves wrote about Filipino clothing in detail. Men wore bahag, which are loincloths, often beautifully decorated. Women wore tapis or patadyong, wraparound skirts made from woven cotton or abaca. The wealthy wore additional layers and elaborate jewelry. In fact, the Spanish were impressed by the quality of Filipino textiles. They noted that the weaving was often finer than what was produced in Spain. We had a textile industry. We were exporting cloth to other countries. Now, was Filipino clothing the same as Spanish clothing? No, and thank goodness for that. Imagine wearing a heavy wool Spanish outfit in Manila heat. You'd pass out from heat stroke. Filipino clothing was perfectly designed for the climate. Light, breathable, practical. That's not primitive. That's smart. The Spanish also wrote about tattoos. The Visayans were covered in them, which is why the Spanish called them pintados, the painted ones. But tattoos weren't instead of clothing. They were art. They were status symbols. Warriors earned their tattoos through achievements in battle. Here's the funny part. When the Spanish tried to make Filipinos wear European clothes, people resisted. Why? Because it was impractical. Eventually, even the Spanish had to start dressing lighter because they couldn't handle their own clothes in tropical heat. The naked savage story was just another way to make us look uncivilized. But our ancestors dressed appropriately for their environment and their culture. There's nothing shameful about that. Lie number 3. The Philippines was isolated until Spain connected us to the world. This one really gets me because it's completely backwards. Before Spain arrived, the Philippines was a major trading hub. Imagine Manila Bay as a busy international airport, except with ships instead of planes. Chinese merchants, Arab traders, Indian merchants, Japanese traders, they all came here regularly. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain from the Tang dynasty, over 1,000 years old. They've found glass beads from India, bronze gongs from Vietnam, jade from China and Taiwan. This wasn't occasional contact. This was regular international trade. We exported gold, and lots of it. Also pearls, shells, beeswax, cotton textiles and hardwoods. The Sulu Sultanate in the 1400s was a major regional power trading with everyone from China to Borneo. Here's what really happened. Spain didn't create trade networks, they disrupted them. The Asian trade routes had been working fine for centuries. Spain tried to monopolize everything and force it through their galleon system. They were inserting themselves into something that already existed and worked well. And you know what? Filipino and Chinese merchants kept trading anyway. Spanish records complain about smuggling, but really people were just continuing their traditional business relationships that predated Spanish control. Manila before Spanish rule was already a cosmopolitan port city with Chinese, Malay and Japanese communities living there. It was internationally connected. So no, we weren't isolated islanders waiting to be discovered. We were in the middle of a thriving maritime trade network that spanned from Japan to the Middle East. Lie number 4. Filipinos couldn't read or write before Spain introduced the alphabet. Remember that copper plate I mentioned? The one from the year 900. It's written in an indigenous script. Let me say that again. Filipinos were writing legal documents in the year 900, over 600 years before the Spanish arrived. We had writing systems, multiple writing systems, Baybayin in Tagalog regions, Kulitan in Pampanga, Badlit in Visayas, and people actually used them. Here's the part that shocked me when I first learned it. Spanish priests wrote that almost everyone could read and write in their own script. Almost everyone. At a time when most Europeans were illiterate, Filipinos had high literacy rates. Father Pedro Chirino, a Spanish priest, writing in 1604, described how Filipinos wrote letters to each other on bamboo and palm leaves. They kept records. They wrote poetry. So what happened to these writing systems? Why don't we use them today? The Spanish suppressed them. All official documents had to be in Spanish using Roman letters. Indigenous scripts were associated with pre-Christian culture, so missionaries discouraged them. Within a few generations, the knowledge faded, not because it was primitive, because it was deliberately replaced. The good news, young Filipinos today are learning Baybayin again. They're getting it tattooed, using it in art. They're bringing it back. But for those of us who grew up being told our ancestors were illiterate, that was a lie. They were literate, they were literary, and they had a rich written tradition before colonization. Lie number 5. Filipino warriors were primitive with crude weapons. Last one, and this might surprise you the most. Your textbook probably said Filipino warriors fought with wooden spears and were easily defeated by superior Spanish technology. The Battle of Mactan was treated like a fluke, like Lapu just got lucky. Here's the reality: Filipino warriors scared the Spanish. First, the weapons. Filipinos forged steel blades that were famous throughout Southeast Asia. The kris, the kampilan, the barong, these weren't crude tools. They were expertly crafted weapons with pattern-welded steel showing advanced metallurgy. Spanish records admit that Filipino steel was often better than their own. Spanish soldiers sometimes preferred captured Filipino blades over their own swords. Filipinos had armor too. Wooden plate armor, sometimes covered in leather or shark skin, that was effective protection. Warriors wore helmets and shields made from hardwoods that could stop sword strikes. And here's something they definitely didn't teach us in school. Filipinos had cannons before the Spanish arrived. Bronze cannons called lantaka. The Spanish encountered fortified positions with artillery. Now about that easy conquest. Magellan arrived in 1521. Spain didn't achieve full control until the early 1900s. That's almost 400 years. The Igorot people in the mountains were never conquered. The Moros in Mindanao fought Spain to a standstill for 300 years. Does that sound like primitive warriors with crude weapons? The Battle of Mactan wasn't luck. It was a well-executed defense by warriors who knew their terrain and had effective weapons. Lapu killed Magellan because he was a skilled military leader commanding capable fighters. The Spanish couldn't admit they struggled for centuries against people they claimed were primitive. So the story got sanitized, and Filipino military capability was erased from the history books.